Hi everybody, welcome to Sunya IAS. Welcome to the mains article discussion. The topic for today is carbon inequality. Now when we talk about climate change, when we talk about how the world is divided in developed and developing, a very good way to understand is the carbon inequality that is present. We know that the developed countries have had historically high emissions, and because of that, the developing countries have to face a lot of problems. So let us understand it in the context of carbon inequality. And to understand it, we should also know data. For example, in the climate change or IPCC lecture, I shared with you a lot of data, but here we will see the data from the perspective of how India is different from the world, how there is a carbon inequality in India itself, how there is an inequality of emissions, how there is inequality between nations. Okay, so all these factors we will understand through data, and then we will see what is the impact of these inequality. Okay, the first thing that you should now focus on is comparison of India with the rest of the world. Right now, maybe some of you are aware about the Oxfam report. ठीक है, शायद आपने पढ़ा हो Oxfam report के बारे में. Oxfam report highlights high levels of income inequality, that perhaps the bottom 50%. Okay, abhi just for a second I'll just tell you and then I move to this. जब income inequality की बात होती है, so we can say that the top 1% have almost a very high share, around 34 to 40%, okay, of the income, whereas the bottom 50% combined, all the 50% have very less share. This highlights income inequality, right? That the income is not uniformly distributed. When we extend this concept to carbon emissions, then we get to understand some other aspects. So अब यहां पे देखते हैं, I'll just tell you that what nomenclature I'm going to use. So to understand the consumption and emission patterns, we will divide the word into three things. Okay, there will be a top 10%, there will be the middle 40%, and there will be the bottom 50%. This will help us analyze how the emissions are happening, right? So let us see this. Now we will also compare India with the world. Now again, global emissions and India's emissions we'll understand. So pehli cheez to, the first thing, what is the national average? Okay, and again this data or this particular data is the comparison of this is as per 2019 levels, okay, based on what was available. Also there will be some other updated data. The moment I share it, I will explain it to you. Fine. Ab dekhiye, the national average, okay, was, this T is 2.2 tons of carbon dioxide. Okay, the national average is 2.2 tons of carbon dioxide, right? Whereas the global average is 6.5 tons of carbon dioxide. What? This is per person. So average person in India consumes, or let's say releases, 2.2 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. All of this is per person, whereas globally it is 3 times. It is 6.5 tons per person. Fine. This is the average. But to understand the population demography better, we will segregate and socio-economic things better. हमने bottom 50 देखा, middle 40 and top 10%. ठीक है, अब देखिए यहां पे bottom 50 में, the bottom 50%, just imagine 50% is a huge, the bottom 50 is 1 ton carbon dioxide emission per person, and from bottom 50 of the global also not much difference. Okay, this is 1 ton, this is 1.6 tons of CO2 per person, right? But as you move up the ladder, there is huge disparity. Like number 1, middle 40 mein there is a 3x difference. The middle 40% consumes 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person. Okay, whereas the middle 40 in the global, it consumes 6 ton, as you see, 6 ton carbon dioxide per person. Okay, so you can see that there is a huge variation in this particular number, right? Then the top 10% also has a variation. the top 10% releases or consumes 8.8 tons of CO2 per person. Okay, whereas the top 10 is 31 tons. Okay, so there is a huge difference. 31 tons CO2 per person. Now, if you compare, when I say carbon inequality, bottom 50 is only releasing 1 ton, and in India the top 10 is releasing 8 tons. So 8 times more emissions they are having per person. So this makes it a startling thing. Same is with respect to global at the global level also. There is a huge disparity in the levels of per person emission. Okay, the top 10% are emitting 31 tons of carbon dioxide per person. Fine. So this is the first thing. And again, when we see all this data, you will understand things in a more comparative and a better perspective. Okay, comparison of India and the world we have seen. Again, I will emphasize the carbon inequality within India. Okay, within India, again, just to make you remember, or always segregate this data in 3 ways. Okay, let's say if I say middle 40%, bottom 50%, and let's say top 10%, right? And this is also not very difficult to remember. How I remember it is, for example, middle 40, basically within India, it consumes around 2.2 tons of CO2. It consumes around 1.2 tons of CO2. And this consumes around or releases 12 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, 2.2, 1.2 and 12. Okay, so again, just to highlight that within India also the carbon inequality is steep. Okay, and this will have, so again इसीलिए जो top 10% है, चाहे वो इंडिया में हो चाहे ग्लोबली हो, they consume or they use products or their lifestyle is such that carbon emissions बहुत ज्यादा हैं. उसकी वजह से, because of that, the maximum problem is faced by the bottom 50. Right? So जैसे there is a problem, and that is why you have to understand there is a problem that we say developed countries are responsible for the issues in developing countries. In the similar manner, within developing countries also, if you segregate top 10 versus the bottom 50, there's a huge difference. That is why you should know carbon inequality. Right? Now, this also is a very important fact to remember. Right? Increase in inequality of emissions. In fact, ये जो fact है, or the fact is increase in carbon emissions, these two will show to you that human interventions या man-made changes are happening at such a fast level that it is very difficult now to adjust. Now, see, increase in inequality की हम बात करते हैं, ठीक है? 2010 में, and within 5 years, just see the difference. 2010 में, the top 10%, in 2010, the top 10% contributed to 34% of the emissions. In 2010, top 10% contributed to 34%, and the bottom 50 contributed to 15% of the emissions. Here also there is inequality, but in the next 5 years, in 2015, top 10% contributed to almost 50%, that is 49% of the emissions of carbon dioxide, while the bottom 50 contributed to only 7%. Okay, so this again can be used as a fact to establish the things which we are discussing, right? That there is a huge difference when it comes to emissions, top 10% and top 50. So now remember this one, that top 10% contribute to almost 50% of carbon dioxide emissions, whereas the bottom 50 contribute to 7% of emissions, right? So because sometimes you might not be able to remember the exact ton, but approximately percentages maybe we can remember, right? Now, inequality between nations, we know that the world is divided between developed and developing countries. Developed countries contribute to around 76% of carbon dioxide emissions, very high number. Developed countries contribute to 76. That is why climate change may you hear every year the divide or the debate between developed versus developing. COP, Conference of Parties में, these countries had agreed कि Green Climate Fund में, in the Green Climate Fund, they will contribute properly $100 billion per year from the developed to developing. Why? Because the historical burden of emission lies with the developed countries. They still contribute around 76%. And again, keep in mind, the industrial revolution of developed nations was prefaced on the wealth or the resources from developing nations. So, अब they have had a huge inequality in emissions. अब carbon inequality का the biggest consequence, which also we'll see in more detail, is that the developing nations and the environment is suffering. And these countries are not willing to take up the responsibility. Okay, so even, and this is why you see COP27, COP28, all these debates happening. We also had a loss and damage fund precisely for this. Okay, I hope you understand. 76%, right? Now, if I talk to you, अब ये भी एक important fact है, increase in carbon emissions. ठीक है? तो अब 1990 से, I'm not taking a huge, let's say, number, from 1990 to 2015, the carbon emissions increased by 60%. In fact, you can also say that this can also be substantiated by IPCC's report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. IPCC reports highlights that initially, or let's say in the previous years, the carbon dioxide emissions was around 287 ppm, and now it has surpassed 415 ppm. It has surpassed 415 ppm, right? So there is an increase in carbon emissions. Okay, so right from inequality between nations, increase in inequality of emissions, carbon inequality in India and the world, we understand that yes, there is a huge, let's say, change which is happening, and the change is skewed. Okay, that the developed countries, and within that the rich population, the top 10%, is contributing the most, whereas the bottom 50 has to face the most burden. This is the point we have to understand here. Okay, now inequality between countries and inequality within countries. When I tell to you that in India 40%, 50%, 10% they are contributing, this means inequality within the country. And inequality between the countries is this fact, that inequality that developed countries contribute 76%. Okay, so here if I quote to you the data of 2019, okay, so here basically what happened, that when we understand the World Inequality Report, the source for this data is World Inequality Report of 2022. In the 2022 report, they are quoting the data of 2019. Okay, so let me tell you what exactly happened here. Initially, the inequality between the countries. So when we had seen the CO2 emissions, okay, so basically, again, two data points I have for you. One, in 1990, when we saw the inequality in the carbon emissions, okay, the between countries, inequality between countries was 63%. Okay, so when we had to see in 1990, the inequality was between countries in terms of emissions, but in 2019, so from 1990 to 2019, the inequality increased within countries. So it did not matter exactly that whether you were a very rich nation or a poor nation, and because within that country, be it rich or poor, the inequalities had increased. This is to emphasize this point, that generally speaking, we only think of inequality between countries and we forget that inequality within countries is also a big contributor. Again, keep the case in mind that the people who are rich and affluent will have different lifestyle choices. They will have more cars. They will use, let's say, more ACs, more refrigerators. So while it is small, but this small chunk will emit a lot more emissions. So you have to think both between countries and also within countries. So the fact is, in 1990, 63% inequality was between countries. But in 2019, the fact remains same. 63% was within countries. The carbon inequality within countries was 63% as per 2019 data mentioned in the World Inequality Report of 2022. Okay. So again, if we keep all these things into context, again, I'll tell you the facts which you should remember. that increase in the carbon emissions has happened. 60% increase in from 1990 to 2015. This is one important fact. Okay, so this is one. Second, you can remember inequality between nations, 76%, right? And then this fact, okay, because I know in the exam hall you would not be able to write down all these facts, but again, this will help build your understanding that if you have to compare between different sets of nation, you can easily compare between these sets of nation. Okay, so that is one. And again, one more fact again I have for you, and then we will see the causes of carbon inequality. I'll tell you. So you have, and we had the industrial revolution. Okay, and by the way, there is a global carbon budget. Okay, so during the industrial revolution, roughly, and from the industrial revolution, it took us 140 years to consume 750, okay, to consume 750 gigaton of the carbon budget. Okay, in 140 years we consumed 750 gigaton, but after that it only took us 25 years to consume this. So you can understand the scale of human interventions. Okay, the people like maybe the people from the developed countries, etc. This shows the rapid scale of development. That पहले 750 gigaton को complete करने के लिए we required 140 years, but now only 25 years. And it is said that by 2030 the top 1%, see, अगर मैं बात करूं top 1% की and the bottom 50%, the top 1% में bottom 50% में almost 100 times का अंदर difference आ जाएगा. There will be a difference of 100 times the quantum of emissions. That is why carbon inequality is a big problem. Imagine 100 times difference. Okay, and it is also said कि जो 1% ये है जो population, the very small chunk of population, richest one, okay, इनका consumption अभी 35 times higher है. They consume 35 times more than what they should. And that is why, because of such high levels of consumption, it will be very difficult to meet our targets. Okay, so remember this fact also, that the global carbon budget is exhausting very quickly because of rapid levels of development, and within that top 1% has 35 times more consumption, right? And there is 100 times difference between the consumption of 1% versus the bottom 50%. Okay, now let us see what are the causes of this carbon inequality. One thing is, of course, we know rich pollute more. Now every point which I say, you can substantiate it from the previous slides. Okay, the rich countries pollute more, we know that. Since the industrial revolution, we know that the developed countries contribute to 76%. So rich pollute more. Yes, there are industries. The industries would require coal, they would require fossil fuel. The development requires energy, so the rich will pollute more. Okay, then the burden of climate change. Here also remember, the burden of climate change lies largely with developed countries. Okay, so again, just think of the steam powered engine, the bigger different mills. Okay, the industrial revolution, ultimately the use of cars, everything releases emissions, even refrigeration, air conditioning, light, energy, all these things, right? And ultimately that is why the carbon dioxide level increases. And here also the developed countries were the main culprit, and that is why it is said that they have the bigger burdens of climate change. So this also released a lot of carbon, or had a lot of carbon inequality. Fine. Now, skewed access to resources. Very true, we know that. When I say that the top 1% consumes 35 times more, why is that? Because they have very high access to resources, number one. And the second thing is that the bottom 50%, they hardly have access to resources. But here also one more thing, we also know that poverty is the biggest polluter. So because they have primitive access to technologies, they use or burn, let's say, wood, they also pollute, right? Similarly, the rich, etc., if they use a lot of private transport, They would not use enough of public transport. That will lead to more emissions. In fact, in New Delhi and in other places also, we've seen tremendous rise in the private vehicles. So they have skewed access to resources. This also contributes to carbon inequality. Let's say if there is a 2 BHK, 3 BHK, every room has an AC, there are more refrigeration, then there is a higher need for food processing. Food processing also requires setting up of cold storage infrastructure. So वहां पे भी there is a skewed access to resources. That will mean more emissions. So यहाँ पे just apply your mind. I am presenting you 4 major points, but you can definitely think even beyond that. What exactly is the reason here? Okay. Then skewed access to resources. अभी हम सोचिए from the farmer's perspective. Generally, so ultimately everything is about land. The rich would have more access to land. On that land, if they set up an industry, if they set up a factory, whatever they set up, that will lead to more emissions, right? And even there also, there are, let's say, if somebody, there are small and marginal farm owners, and there are big, let's say, landowners within the farmers. So the bigger ones, they have access to more mechanization. More mechanization means more emissions. ठीक है? इसको ऐसे समझ सकते हैं, you can understand it. And then lifestyle issues, the point I was telling you. You have more money to spend. Let's say, even when you have to mine the bitcoins, you require a powerful computer. That requires more energy, means more emissions. Okay. So right from our computing choices, our eating choices, okay, the consumption patterns. Let's say if there is more need of, let's say, rice, meat, etc. So the agriculture has to be transformed in such manner. So that means even more emissions. So you can think of each sector, right? So wahan pe you can understand that skewed access to resources and ultimately lifestyle issues also contribute a lot to this problem of carbon inequality. Correct? Now we have understood both कि हम समझ गए data. We have understood the data and we have also understood the causes. Now this is the main part. What is the impact of carbon inequality? And many times what happens, we only think from a economic angle or environmental angle. Again, please remember, try to think of as many dimensions as possible, and specifically the dimension of social angle. Okay, so that is why I'm going to start firstly with the social angle. What is the social impact of carbon inequality, right? Again, what do we think about it? Number one, think the impact on women. You have heard of concepts like feminization of agriculture, feminization of poverty. Put this into the climate change perspective. Women, okay, would have access to very, let's say, small pieces of land. They are in fact engaged in a lot of small and marginal being farmers. Okay? They have very less access to capital. कुछ ज़्यादा insurance नहीं होता. अब इसीलिए when within the developed countries or even in the developing countries, they do not have money, and because of all these factors, these are vulnerable sections. ठीक है? अब जो vulnerable sections हैं, okay, so what will happen? If there is a carbon inequality, these sections are most probable to have hazardous impact of climate change. तो अब climate change की वजह से, because of carbon inequality, there can be more extreme weather events. Women will be disproportionately impacted. Okay. So one is this. So again, be it in terms of land, be it in terms of water availability, ये सारे issues will impact the women. And same is true also for the vulnerable population. Again, imagine India's coastline. There are more let's say more floods, more cyclones which are happening. Think about the vulnerable coastal communities. Think about the infrastructure they have. It will be weak, fragile infrastructure. So because of this carbon inequality, if there is a hazard, will they be able to cope up? In most cases not. So they will be the first line of casualty. So इसीलिए this is also one of the bigger impacts, and that is why the governments have to take care of the vulnerable communities, women, children, elderly population first. तो ये social dimension हम याद रखेंगे. Then health hazards are there. Okay. So if there is carbon inequality, number one issue, let's say there is worsening air quality and there is worsening, let's say, water. Okay, there is a lot of emissions, a lot of untreated wastewater, etc. goes down. What if this, let's say, air, water, all the natural things are consumed by the vulnerable population? They cannot do a lot of filtration, etc. So there will be mosquito borne diseases, there will be infections of lungs, cardiovascular diseases. तो ये सारे प्रॉब्लम्स होंगे, तो मोर हेल्थ हजार्ड ऑल्सो. और हेल्थ हजार्ड भी किसको ज्यादा इंपैक्ट करेगा? अगेन द बॉटम 50%. तो यू हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड कि कार्बन इनइक्वालिटी का इंपैक्ट पूरे सेक्शन पे क्या होगा. व्हाट इज द इंपैक्ट ऑन द एंटायर सेक्शन? ओके. एंड अल्टीमेटली इट बर्डन्स द पुअर. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, व्हेन वी से अबाउट विमेन, देयर इज अ डबल एंड अ ट्रिपल बर्डन. इश्यूज ऑफ हेल्थ, हंगर, माल न्यूट्रिशन, उसके ऊपर से यू कैन इवन एड वन मोर बर्डन ऑफ क्लाइमेट चेंज. Right? So these are vulnerable sections. Again, agar koi disaster, if there's a disaster happening, after or just during the disaster, a lot of health problems come in. There is an onset of a health diseases, be it cholera, malaria, etc. Again, who is impacted more? Vulnerable sections. Okay? So these are the social impacts. Then we talk about economic impacts. Now, economic impacts you will generally understand. Of course, there is a difficulty in recovery. Recovery means you have to spend more money on infrastructure, more money on technology. Okay? So difficult recovery will take time, and not only just time, it will take money. Who has more money? Developed nations. Are they giving the money to developing nations? In many cases not. So isliye there is a stalemate, there is a problem. So there will be difficulty in recovery. There will also be economic instability. Think about it. The skewed access to resources will cause an economic instability. Okay, be it in terms of agriculture, access to land. Okay, because वहां पे भी there can be desertification, land degradation, deforestation. ये तो already हो रहा है. तो उसकी वजह से जो economic impact होगा, okay, that मान लीजिए, think of economic impact like developing nation में the bottom 50 now has poor health. Think about that this population for some time will not be available productively. उसकी वजह से economic instability आ सकती है. Same if even if the capital, let's say NCR, यहाँ पे air quality worsen हो रही है, a lot of productive workforce will be suffering economic instability. Same impact on agriculture. If there is a carbon inequality, so the agricultural yields may also change. वहां पे भी आ जाएगा issue. Okay. Then think about economic instability because of hazards, because of disasters. Disasters की वजह से भी economic instability आएगी, right? So next point again is a linked point, impact of disasters, right? Because of carbon inequality, we will see more extreme weather events. Okay, the frequency and intensity of these extreme weather events is going to change. More hurricanes, typhoons, floods, cyclones, etc. और उसका भी impact, social impact होगा. But this is also going to harm या damage the infrastructure. उसको repair या recover करने में आपको और ज़्यादा पैसा लगेगा. You have to spend more money. Again a problem. And again it, let's say, harms the most vulnerable sections. Again a problem. ठीक है? There will be unequal growth. We have seen that. Only a small segment, 1%, a top 10%, they are increasing. Okay, अब उसकी वजह से there can be social tensions. Right? The bottom 50% will think after a point of time कि यार हमारा all the economic, social सारे impacts हमारी तरफ हो रहे हैं. But only a very small section. So this will lead to non-inclusive growth. You read about inclusive growth in GS3. अब यहां पे क्या growth equal है? नहीं, the growth is not equal. Then reduced demographic strength. Again आप समझ सकते हैं जो demography है, in that a big chunk of that demography is either not fit. Okay, they are facing health issues, they are facing issues because of disasters. So your demography ideally which would have helped you or any country, it is not totally available. Again a problem. This will impact the GDP projections. हर जगह problem आएगी इस चीज में, right? Political impact. अब देखिए policies, right? For example, India has National Action Plan on Climate Change. India ने अपने NDCs बनाए. So India's policies are also impacted by this, and this is at the level of India. Think at the level of COP28. Okay, think at the level of other countries. तो जो पॉलिसीज हैं, पॉलिसीज आर ऑल्सो इंपैक्टेड बिकॉज ऑफ दिस। ओके, और एक और चीज, जो एग्जिस्टिंग लेवल ऑफ पॉलिसीज हैं, वी ऑल्सो डिस्कस दिस इन द आईपीसीसी लेक्चर, the existing targets are not even sufficient to meet our requirements for 2030 and 2100. So that means they have to be again changed. Policies are ineffective at this point of time. There is a reduced bargaining power also. This is a true reality. Developed or developing mein, developing also does not have the equal bargaining power. Okay, again, just to highlight that the countries who have historically high emissions, they have the capacity, or let's say the audacity, to even walk out of prominent deals, to not honor their commitments, and still they come at the global stage and they give long lectures. तो यहां पे भी, यहां पे this is a true issue. There is a reduced bargaining power. Political impact में आप एक और चीज सोच सकते हो. Because of carbon inequality, we can think of climate refugees. That the people going to other places, अब उसकी वजह से again a social impact can happen. Okay, which means social impact क्या होगा? There can be, हो सकता है जो current community है, they might not like a lot of refugees coming in, as we have seen. So this can also have economic and a social impact. So political, economic, social will go hand in hand. And of course we know environmental impact तो है ही. Carbon emission से क्या होगा? Number one, we know this will cause increase in global warming. जो average rise है temperature का, whatever is the average rise, this will increase faster, and this can trigger disasters. That is why I always say environment and disaster management goes hand in hand. There are climate induced disasters also. If you see the recent climate change, let's say events which have happened, it has led to a lot of disasters, right? तो ये सारे हैं impacts carbon inequality के. And you can even go more micro. For example, in environment, you can even think of the impact of on biodiversity. So यहाँ पे developing nations, for example, India is a biodiversity hotspot. But because of this carbon inequality, a lot of the species at a later point of time might get extinct. And if we lose the biodiversity, again a problem. What if we lose the coral reefs, mangroves at an Indian level also and at a global level also? And वहाँ पे भी ज़्यादा, let's say, harmful impact होगा developing nations को, not developed nations. And similarly, within nations, the sections, the top 10 or 1% will always have more resources. They might be able to withstand the impact. Okay, तो आपको between countries or within countries दोनों चीजें याद रखनी है. Okay, you have to remember both within and between countries. So now we've understood the data, we've understood the causes, we've understood the wide-ranging implications. Let us understand. अब इसमें way forward क्या होगा? Okay, what should be the way forward, right? So number one is to have better insurance penetration. Okay, so that at least the bottom 50% have better insurance, be it in terms of land, be it in terms of their health insurance. अगर ये चीजें होंगी, so you one, the government will be better able to take care of its people. तो इंश्योरेंस पेनिट्रेशन को बढ़ाना थोड़ा सा इंपॉर्टेंट है. ओके, और इंश्योरेंस की नीड क्यों है? वी आर टॉकिंग ऑफ अ possible environmental problems, catastrophe, unexpected events. That is why this makes it better. Okay. Then tracking is very important. Until and unless we do not know the data at a global level, at India level, also within India, what is the level, state level, हर तरह का data नहीं होगा. So how can we then make proper policies? I said that the policies are ineffective. How to make them effective? Number one, track it. Then have evidence-based or data-driven policy making. Use these keywords in your answer. Evidence based या data driven policy है, tracking जरूरी है. Okay, so that is one. We have to understand that environment is a global common. It is a common property for all. Be it you are rich or poor, be it developed or developing, everybody has to embrace climate change. And here also remember, we have to abide by principles like CBDR and CBDR-RC. Common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. The countries would differ in their responsibilities. Developed nations emit 76%. उनकी responsibility ज़्यादा है. And also capability is different. Capability of Somalia, let's say Uganda, Chad, Niger, South Asia, Southeast Asia is less compared to developed nations of EU or US. तो ये principle हम ज़रूर याद रखेंगे climate change में. CBDR-RC, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Okay, common property. I hope you are able to understand this point, right? Next, women empowerment. I told you, at least at a social level, we have to know, we understand that there's a huge disproportionate impact on women. That is why women empowerment, be it terms of better access to resources, better financial support, okay, better access to technology. If I talk about agriculture, so again, the machine implements should also be such that the women can properly use them. Okay, they should be able to understand, and ultimately, if you do proper women empowerment, we'll be able to better take care of the half population of the world, right? So women empowerment will go a long way. Okay, again, just think that if they have better access to resources, chulha, for example, हमने देखा है कि if the women do not have access to, let's say, clean technologies, the chulha will be a big source of indoor air pollution. It releases a lot of black carbon, okay, and which is why the government schemes tackling this particular issue, okay. Again, those who are watching, tell me what is the name of the scheme which I'm referring to in this case, number one. Second, in other dimensions also, women empowerment will definitely help. SDG 5 helps to tackle SDG 1, 2, 3, 4 and other SDG, be it poverty, hunger, right? So ye zaruri hai women empowerment. Then focus on renewable, absolutely yes. India's target is that by 2030, 50% of our electricity or energy demands will come from renewable sector. And this is true not just for developing countries, also for developed, as much renewable as you can. This will help, okay? Because this will reduce the carbon emissions. That is what we want, okay? And there can be other points. For example, we can shift to low carbon emissions, and low carbon emissions also in the long term, okay? Then better use of technology. Okay, and when I say technology, अभी आप बहुत points सोच सकते हो. Think about transport sector, decarbonizing the transport sector. How? Electric vehicles. How? Use of biofuels, ethanol blending, right? Similarly, अब ये तो सिर्फ एक sector वो transport. Think about other sectors. Think about real estate. Think about construction. Okay, तो ultimately जहां जहां भी carbon ज़्यादा use होता है, उसको कम करना है हमें. We have to have better lifestyle. Again, go watch the video. हमने बात करी है mission life की, lifestyle for environment. You can also talk about it. That's a very comprehensive video. वो भी carbon को deal करेगा, right? Again, think of sustainable agriculture. Agriculture has a lot of emissions. So if you target agriculture as a sector, again, think of methane or paddy cultivation. Think of the feeds which is given to the livestock. हर चीज में technology can be used. Okay, we can promote sustainable lifestyles in this manner and ultimately reduce the carbon. More awareness is needed. Behavioral changes लाने होंगे. That is why this mission life will also be integrated in this particular thing. Okay. Then how we deal with the waste. So waste to energy में, if we have better access to technology, we will reduce the carbon emissions. Okay. So again, think about pollution. So think about loss of biodiversity. ये सारी चीजें भी linked हैं इससे, carbon inequality से. So we have to work here. And you can add even more points. You can even add or think about India's Panchamrit, the 5 pledges which India had. And you can even link it here, okay? Because this is a important topic, right? Then think about net zero. Ultimately, if the countries transition to net zero, that is great. How can countries transition? Role of public is very important. Role of private or let's say the corporate sector is also very important. We need advocacy, we need climate advocacy, we need pressure groups, activists. Okay, all of this to ensure that this happens. तो others में अगर मैंने लिखा है तो you can add multiple points here. इससे पहले भी the lectures which I've taken, be it IPCC और other mains article discussion, वहां से भी हम कुछ points borrow कर सकते हैं. अब यहाँ पे भी again the people who are watching it suggest or tell us some new things which can be done to tackle the problem of carbon inequality. ठीक है, this topic is also very comprehensive. तो आप इसमें सोचे, the more you brainstorm, you will also come up with very good points, right? So I hope you are able to understand this whole topic very comprehensively. Data, because data here is important, and at least I would want आपका takeaway ये होना चाहिए इस लेक्चर से, at least 2-3 sets of data हो आपके पास. Other than that, this multi-dimensional holistic mains analysis हम बार बार कर रहे हैं, and I hope by now it has become a habit for you. If it has become a habit, you will be rewarded in your mains, right? So impacts, solutions, way forward. Now I hope you are able to understand. Again, I'll be looking at your comments very carefully. Okay, again, for those of you who want the access to notes, you can join our Telegram channel, Sunya Notes 50. Okay, and we will again meet in the next main article discussion. Thank you.